Well, I knew Lula somewhat before he was elected, and had a very high opinion of him. And when in his early programs, I did join those who were critical of them, felt they should have moved more towards social issues rather than paying off the banks. But in retrospect, I think he made choices that were defensible, maybe not the best. But I think things have, by comparative standards, I think things worked out moderately well. Could have been better, but what couldn't? Considering the pressures and the choices, maybe this was a reasonable thing to do. There are very serious issues, and they remain. I mean, for one thing, Brazil remains one of the most unequal societies in the world. I mean, it's a little improved because of the support programs, which did help people, but the gulf between the very wealthy and the huge mass of impoverished people is enormous. The environmental problems are serious. I mean, the destruction of the Amazonian region continues. It's a problem not only for Brazil, but for the world. The Amazon is a kind of an oxygen source for the entire world. The logging is very dangerous. It's very harmful to the indigenous people. There is some effort to protect indigenous people. It's good that there's some effort, but it's by no means enough. Right before Lula's election, I happened to meet with MST leaders, and I asked them about their relation to the PT, and they said they're not part of it. They have their own goals and concerns. They may have sympathetic cooperation on some issues, but they're keeping separate from it. And I think their issues have not really been addressed. It's the most important popular movement in the world, I think, and done very significant things, but it remains an outside movement with aspirations that are not fulfilled. And there are a lot of interesting things going on in Brazil that aren't government policy, like participatory budgeting, for example. Well, it's important development. Things like that could spread. It would be significant. So it's an exciting place. I think it's nothing new, but there are real problems with the development model. I mean, a development model that's based primarily on primary product export is, first of all, it's not stable, but it also it can be harmful. It yields what's called the resource curse. You distorts currencies. It undermines domestic production. You're relying more and more on imports of foreign goods and so on. I don't think any developed country has ever developed that way. Certainly the United States didn't. And I think that's a fundamental problem that has to be resolved. Actually, the U.S. model is a kind of an interesting one. For a century, Brazil has been called the potential colossus of the South, corresponding to the colossus of the North. So how did the colossus of the North get to be the colossus of the North? Well, it was given, back at the time of the American Revolution, there was economic advice given, advice on what's called sound economics. In fact, the principles of the IMF and the Washington Treasury Department still, and the economics profession still give. It was given by Adam Smith, good source. He instructed the colonies that they should follow the laws of sound economics. They should keep to what was later called their comparative advantage, which was the production of primary products. They should import from England its superior industrial goods, manufactured goods, at that time primitive manufacture, but it was there. They should certainly not try to impose tariffs and develop their own industry competitive with England. Crucially, they should not try to monopolize the essential commodities. And remember, the essential commodity in that period was cotton. Cotton was the oil of the early industrial revolution, which took off from textiles and so on. So we shouldn't monopolize cotton. That was the advice, and that's sound economics, right out of the Washington Consensus today. Well, the colonies were independent, so they were free to violate all the principles of sound economics, which they did. They immediately established high tariffs to bar superior British manufacturers. That enabled the beginning of a textile industry, which is the beginning of economic development. There are spin-offs from that, things that provide the industry with needed materials and so on. Went on through developing a steel industry, rejecting superior British steel, developing our own steel industry. Meanwhile, they went on to try to monopolize cotton. That was the reason for the primary reason for the annexation of Texas and the invasion and the conquest of half of Mexico. Was an open effort to try to monopolize cotton. They didn't quite make it, but came close. And the purpose of that was both for industrial development, for domestic development, but also for international reasons. You have to recall, in those days, the big enemy was Britain. They had the big army and big navy and so on. They were constraining the colonies. That's why they tried several times. They could never conquer Canada because the British were in the way. Couldn't conquer Cuba because the British Navy was in the way. So if you look back in the 1840s, the presidents were openly saying, if we can monopolize cotton, we can bring Britain to our feet because we'll control their main economic resources. In fact, they were trying to do just what was charged ridiculously to Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. Of course, it was outlandish, but the charge was, well, he's trying to monopolize oil. Well, that's just what the American colonies did, exactly the opposite of the precepts of sound economics. And the country developed by the late 19th century. It was the richest country in the world. It had rich agricultural, mineral, other resources, but did develop industrially. And in fact, this is not unique. Every developed country, starting with England, has followed pretty much the same course. So reliance on primary commodity production has never worked, and there's no reason to believe that it ever will. So I think it's a mixed story in Brazil. It does have industry and so on, but there's a question about what the direction the economy ought to take, and there's plenty of questions about the fundamental internal and social problems in Brazil. Some steps have been made, but a long way to go.